It was Martin Luther King Day, or it was Martin Luther King weekend, and they should have respected Martin Luther King. But she had no perspective as far as American Indians were concerned. Well, that's very logical because she doesn't think about American Indians. As a matter of fact, the debate really isn't very realistic as far as American Indians are concerned, because nobody understands the perspective of American Indians. A lot of people don't even recognize the fact that you guys still exist. What should have happened?
There should have been nothing happening at the.
Well, I mean, well, actually, there was a confrontation going on between the white high school kids, and there were a group of African Americans that were just saying some really horrible things. They were black Israelites, is what they refer to themselves as. It's a religious group, and they don't read the New Testament as much as they read the Old Testament. So they consider themselves Jewish. Jewish people don't consider them Jewish, but they consider themselves Jewish. And these guys were standing there just ripping these kids apart. Now the weird part was, these kids had been there for an hour. They went to the Lincoln Memorial, and maybe they were there for the march. I don't know. But the kids were there just listening to these people and firing back and forth. And when Nathan Phillips and his American Indian group saw what was going on, they tried to get in between the two groups so that there wouldn't be any more of a confrontation. That was what was going on. And this kid tried to stare down the Omaha elder. So what should have happened? What should the kid have done?
Just walked away. Yep.
Not tried to stare him down. He's an elder. I mean, who does that? Who raised that kid?
Yeah.
There was a video, like you know how they're playing the victim, but there's this video like these girls who were there. I guess those boys in that group, they were yelling and you know like saying like awful things to those girls too because of you know pro-life and how women shouldn't have abortions and stuff. They were yelling at them, saying stuff to them, harassing them.
This was actually a pro-life
Yeah, so they were
march.
I think problematic there.
Wait a minute, these are high school kids. They were there on a high school trip, and they took them to a pro-life march? Is that what was going on?
It was called March for Life, but it's all pro-life. Like they have all these signs and...
Yeah, I didn't see the signs. Maybe I ought to look into it more. I'm real upset that kid tried to stare down the elder.
There's another video. I don't know if it took place at the same time. It seems like it was, but when you brought up the African Americans that were with a different religion, now I kind of figure that was them who was yelling at all the people who were wearing the Donald Trump hats. And
Oh yeah, I saw that.
you saw that one? He was all saying like, you never see a Hispanic, Native American shoot up a school with all these, and they ran and they took off.
They were like, yeah.
I think he struck a nerve.
Interesting. Just really, really interesting. Well, should young people respect old people? That's a question.
Of course.
Should they?
Respect everybody.
Well, everybody should respect everybody. It makes more sense. But he's a 17-year-old kid. Should he have tried to stare down that older gentleman? Whether he was American Indian or whether he was African American, doesn't age have something? Doesn't wisdom have something?
You know, that there,
Okay.
there's actually all ways to look at it, because from what I've seen through the video, the kid obviously didn't know what he was doing. But
Oh, yeah, exactly.
But then, you know, it kind of shows, he showed interest in what the Native American was doing. And so was everybody, because if you actually listen to how they were trying to go along with the beat of the drum and the song, there was a certain point they were actually doing that. But then again, you know, they were just like making fun of it. They were like reacting, adopting each other's behavior. When somebody laughs, another person laughs, so they were just like, you can see what we can do. But then in there, they were actually trying to adapt to the music. And they were dancing around and stuff like that. But then that kid he like showed up in his face and stuff like that. But then, you know, just that alone, you know, there's different ways you can look at it. Because it's disrespectful for him to do that.
Right.
But then, you know, he was standing his ground for whatever reason that he was doing that for. But then, you know, he smiled at him. He was listening to him. He was actually just going along with what the Native American was singing about. And I could see in there, on his face, in his concentration, that he could actually feel that spirit of that drum and that song. And it's just like, he's confused. He's too young to realize what's going on. But then little did they know that they were actually making something bad to mature people.
I saw him as being disrespectful. I saw him as trying to stare the drummer down, which is something you maybe that's okay in wrestling, professional wrestling. They try to stare each other down, but not in a social confrontation like that.
Overall, the way I look at it, it's just a clash of cultures. That's all it is, you know. Different people with different beliefs.
Right.
And everything like that. They were there at the wrong reason. But at the beginning, those Islamic people that were using the word of the Bible and religious perspectives shouldn't have said what they had to say. Because I remember that in there, they were telling Native Americans, way before you even had your totem pole, way before you even had your God, you guys believe in the same God that we did. And that's what started off. The Native Americans looked at me, tried telling them to shut up, you know, just be quiet, you know. But they used that. And after thinking about it, it's like, maybe it was a plot, a plan to strategize something.
Yeah.
Because they were from a different belief across seas.
Right.
And who knows how much they would have got paid and how much that would have been planned out, knowing that these different groups of people were there to start something like that. So it's just like, you could actually look at it as a terrorist plan as well too. And then after everything started.
Wait. They weren't Islam. They weren't Muslim. They were Israel. Israel. They were a black Christian group who studied the Old Testament more than they studied the New Testament. They didn't have anything to do with Islam. They didn't have anything to do with Islam at all.
Well, either way, you know, they were trying to start something. And
Well, yeah, they were yelling. They were saying some really horrible things to the kids, to the Right for Life group. So it was really kind of an odd situation. But it could have turned into a really nasty situation. And actually, when the Native American group came through, they actually placated, or they got in between the two groups so that there couldn't be a confrontation, which was their point, which was their idea. The problem is, one of the problems is that not all groups have the same respect. They don't have respect for everybody else. The reality is everybody should respect everybody else's ideas, everybody else's culture, everybody else's religion. But this hasn't happened at all, anywhere, ever. The English tried to conquer the entire world and tried to spread their idea of culture to everybody. So did the Spanish. So did the Russians. I mean, and the Americans. We're trying to spread our politics all over the world. We want everybody to have a democracy. We don't want anybody to have a different form of government, especially not a communist government. So part of the problem is people don't respect each other. Religions don't respect other religions. It's really kind of tragic that you have an idea that is a relatively positive idea, but they can't get over the fact that other people might have different ideas. This has been happening with Islam. This has been happening with all evangelical religions. They have tried to tell everybody that they're wrong and we are right. You don't go to a church and the church says, well, you know, this religion is a good one, but you know, all the other religions are good too. That's not what people say. They say, well, ours is the one true religion. Isn't that what they all say? The Catholics say that. The Protestants say that. The different denominations of Protestants say that. So if you're not a member of my group, then you're incorrect. Isn't that what everybody's saying? Isn't that why we're mad at the Russians? We're telling them that you're incorrect. Of course, some of the things that they did, it's hard to agree with what they did. Okay.
You know, to me, the whole thing is just a wake-up call for everybody. To respect one another, you know?
I don't know, I don't see anybody waking up.
It should be. It should be.
We've been yelling back and forth at each other for a really long time, and we haven't awakened yet. What am I talking about here? Where am I? Oh yeah, we're talking about World War II. I was telling you about what was going on with Kenneth Clark. I got it. With Kenneth Clark. Oh, there you go. And maybe Fitz Clark, they were talking about segregation in the United States. This is a really serious problem. And we're talking about respect and how people, and that everybody should respect each other. Obviously, this has been going on. Emery was talking about how up in Utah, they restructured the school system so that they wouldn't have to allow American Indians to go to their school. And this has been going on in the South forever. I mean, they were segregated, they had separate but equal schools. They had black schools and white schools. If you were white, you couldn't go to a black school. And if you were black, you certainly couldn't go to a white school. And this went on from the end of the Civil War until the 1970s. Actually, they have resegregated the schools in the South. They've been able to do it through the precepts of religion. So what the white people did, they opened up private schools. They stopped funding public schools as much as they were before, and they started building Christian schools. They started building religious schools, and now all the white kids go to the religious schools, and all the black kids go to the public schools. It's the way they've done things. Now, one of the interesting things about the confrontation, this was in Covington, Kentucky. Does anybody know anything about Covington?
Dr. Wolf said that it's kind of a poor town. So when you say white privilege, apparently it means like, you know, they're really not privileged because it's not a gated community.
You can say that,
It's just really poor. So I don't know if that's
There's a lot of different degrees of poor and rich, okay? So they're not the richest people in the world, but they're also, it's also it's on the Ohio River. So and it's right beside Cincinnati. So Cincinnati's up here and Covington's down here. Well, if you're black, you live in Cincinnati. And if you're white, you live either in the suburbs of Cincinnati or you live in Covington, Kentucky. Okay. There's actually a black section of Covington, Kentucky, but it's close to the river. It's not as nice. So we've got all these suburbs of Covington, and these are the white enclaves. So all the white people either live in the suburbs of Cincinnati or they live in Covington, because Covington is actually Kentucky. Ohio is a more liberal place. Covington is a very, how can I say this? Covington is very white, except for that one black enclave. It's right there next to the river. So yeah. So I don't know if you were noticing who the people in the background, all those other kids from Covington, but they were all white. I know, they're all white. And it's the way that they've resegregated the South. And of course, the same thing potentially is happening in the North. If you've got a Lutheran school, how many black Lutherans are there? If you've got a Catholic school, how many black Catholics are there? Not nearly as many. So it's fairly lily white. The black section of town's right next to the ballpark, so I know. All-America Ballpark. Actually, All-America Ballpark is here, and the football field's right next to it. So both of them are right next to each other, so they can utilize each other's parking. They used to have just one stadium, but then they decided you can't play football in a baseball stadium, or you can't play baseball in a football stadium, so they built separate stadiums. This is Cincinnati. I'm from Muncie. Muncie's about 100 miles north of Cincinnati, so a lot of times we go down to the Cincinnati ball games. We went to the Cincinnati ball games when it was Crosley Field. This is way back in the 60s, so not that that's important. Anyway, okay. Lots of arguments going on in the United States. We've always had lots of arguments going on in the United States. And social psychology tried to solve those problems. We've got one right now with the confrontation between the kids from Covington and the American Indian elder. The Omaha. Who are the Omaha? Where are they? Omaha, yeah, well, they're north of Omaha, actually. Yeah, they've got their own reservation up there. What language? Omaha, what language do they speak?
Punka.
I'm sorry?
Punka.
Unka?
Punka.
Punka?
Yeah.
No, actually, they're Sioux. They speak a Sioux language.
They also speak Punka.
Maybe true.
Yeah.
You're talking about those guys in Oklahoma?
Yeah.
Okay.
They're saying, they actually claim to be one people. Also, Winnebagos.
Winnebago's Ho-Chunk.
Yeah, Ho-Chunk and Winnebago. Then Omaha's actually adopted some of the language from the Winnebago. And also the Sioux, but mostly.
Now be careful, you're talking about two different tribes. You're saying one adopted their language from somebody else.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you gotta be real careful of that, because everybody adopted their own language,
I
right?
actually know a lot of people from Omaha, and Punkas too.
I lived there for 10 years, so, yeah, we used to deal with those guys all the time. Interesting people. Real nice people. They got their own casino, which is kind of cool. We were in Omaha. They used to come down for the dental clinic to get their teeth fixed. I know, we were at St. Joseph Hospital. So they adopted their language from the Ho-Chunk. You know, the Ho-Chunk were up in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
And then the story goes that Winnebagos and Ho-Chunks are actually one people, they separated. So is the Punka and the Omaha.
the Ponca were farther south, they were way south. And the Omaha and the Oto were right there in around Omaha. And the Ho-Chunk were way up in northern Wisconsin and northern Minnesota. Okay. They all got thrown together when they started moving people around.
It's probably just like how they say Navajos and some of the Apache have the same kind of language.
Yeah. Well, there's a group up in Canada with the same language.
Yeah.
And all the natives in Alaska, all the natives who aren't Alaskan natives, the Aleuts and the Inuits, they're all Athabascan as well. So they speak the same language as well. And the Hupa out in California. So there's lots of problems going on all over the place. Ethical concerns spurred discussion and reform in the 1960s and 1970s. Before the 1960s and 1970s, what happened during World War II, we were trying to pull everybody together. Remember, we had that horrible problem where they were trying to stop the immigration in the 1920s. So there was a lot of social conflict going on where people were trying to separate each other. And so people were angry at the Italians, and they're angry at the Irish. They were trying to separate themselves from other individuals. Then in the 1960s and 1970s, they tried to pull during World War II, they tried to pull everybody together. We need to fight a war, and we don't want the Italians not fighting with us. We don't want the Germans not fighting with us. We want all Americans to be the same thing. So if you watch the movies from the 1940s and early 1950s, it's as if everybody's brothers. And we talked about Greeks as if they were the same as people from anywhere else. So they were trying to bring everybody together so that they could fight the war. And that's actually what happened. They were able to fight the war, and people started feeling more brotherly toward everybody else in the United States. So it really didn't matter what color hair you had. Remember, they were trying to stop immigration because they had all these Catholics coming in from southern Europe and Eastern Europe, and they were Catholic, and they had black hair. So you could tell who they were just by the color of their hair. Well, if you watch a movie from the 1930s and 1940s, before World War II, if you watch a movie from before World War II, there wasn't anybody with black hair. Rita Hayworth was actually Mexican. She had her father was from Mexico, and she had black hair. Well, they dyed her hair. First, they dyed her hair blonde, and then they dyed it red. But they wouldn't put her in a movie with black hair because they didn't have anybody with black hair in the movies, because they were there was a negative image of individuals who had black hair. But then in the 1950s, 1940s, everything changed. And the reason everything changed is because we needed to fight World War II, and they wanted everybody to pitch in and help, no matter what side of town they lived in, or whether they lived in an Italian enclave, or whether they were Jewish. It really didn't matter. They needed everybody to fight the war. And of course, and even African Americans, which was kind of an interesting thing, because people in the South tried to pretend that African Americans didn't exist, even though the 30% of their population was black. They tried to pretend that they didn't exist. But during World War II, of course, we needed that labor, and we needed them as soldiers. So one of the things that happened was we changed the way that we presented all people in the United States. If you remember Our Gang television shows from the 30s and 40s, there were all these kids were getting together and getting into trouble. Spanky and Buckwheat and the gang. What was the other guy's name? The guy with the Alfalfa. Yeah, Alfalfa. All those kids that get into trouble. Well, there were African Americans in that group, which was kind of interesting, because that was in the 1930s, before they tried to integrate African Americans into the American culture, tried to bring them in as equal partners. And of course, if you watch the Our Gang comedies, African Americans were there. All the kids were equal as far as that went. And of course, you couldn't really tell. Froggy, I guess. Froggy was another one. You couldn't tell what ethnic group anybody came from, except for the African Americans in the group. So that was in the 1940s, and then in the 1950s they tried to reintegrate things, or to resegregate things, but it didn't really work very well, because the soldiers coming back from war, they had all bled and died with all of these individuals, and so it was really difficult for them to turn back the hands of time, but they were able to do that in the South. So in the 60s and 70s, we had a movement in the United States to integrate everybody, and that included the people in the South. Remember, the civil rights laws were finally signed in the 1960s. Actually, it was 1965. Martin Luther King Jr. was marching at this time in the early 60s. Into 1968, he was actually assassinated in 1968. And one of the reasons, and I told you this last time, one of the reasons that Martin Luther King Jr. is honored today is because he was a symbol of peace. There were black groups that wanted to arm and fight in the streets. There were riots going on all over the United States. There were riots in Detroit, in Newark, New Jersey, in Cincinnati. There were none in Chicago, but there were several riots out in Los Angeles, in the south central section of Los Angeles. So potentially it could have been open warfare between blacks and whites. And of course, if it had become open warfare, what would other minorities have done? What would Hispanics have done? What would American Indians have done? Well, we know what American Indians would have done. because the American Indian movement started right after that, seeking equal rights in the United States. So we know who you guys, which side you guys would have fought on. Now the problem was we had all these liberal white people, but how can you tell the difference between a conservative white guy and a liberal white guy? Do they look different? Do they wear a different hat? We know if you wear a MAGA hat, Make America Great Again hat, then that's a mark of conservatism. But people weren't wearing hats back then, so how in the world could you tell the difference? Well, you could look at the clothes that they wore, or you could look at their hair. The more liberal they were, the more hair they had, as stupid as that sounds. And of course, if they were liberal, then they wore hippie clothes. They wore hip clothes that were a little bit different. So it was really kind of interesting. And of course, I was right in the middle of all this, and I had to decide which side. I thought it was that we were going to have civil war in the United States. I had to decide which side I was on. You think I'm kidding? It could have been open warfare. So I had to decide which side I was on. I had to decide how white I was. And I chose the other side. That's why I never became an officer when I was in the military. I didn't want people to mistake me for one of the bad guys. That's why I never became an officer. I had a bachelor's degree when I joined the military, but I never became an officer because I didn't want to be confused for one of the bad guys. Protection of experimentation. Okay, so we're talking about social psychology. And of course, I've lived through a massive social psychology experiment. But there were people that were experimenting, trying to figure out what the hell was going on out there. Yes, sir.
What chapter is this on?
This is where I'm still in chapter 1.
Oh, okay. I'm trying to find out.
Yeah, I'm going really slow. And I blame Denise for it. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Protection of experimental participants from psychological distress became a concern following the Milgram experiment and the Zimbardo Stanford prison study. Let me explain to you what these two studies were. We were trying to figure out why the Nazis did what the Nazis did, why the Germans did what the Germans did. Didn't make any sense. They just tried to exterminate all these people. They killed them, and then they had to do something with the bodies. So what do you do when you've got tens of thousands of bodies?
You burn it.
That's an awfully big hole.
You use it?
The best way to do it, I mean, if you've got a human body, then what are you going to do? You can let it decompose, I guess, but that smells pretty bad. You don't want to do that. So what they did, they burned them, and they turned them into ash. I know, that's so logical. And that's what all these Nazi death camps were all about. They were killing their enemies. And they considered Jewish people their enemies, of course, so they tried to exterminate as many Jewish people as they possibly could. Now, if you understand what was going on in Europe prior to the Nazis, you understand that there weren't a whole lot of people that liked Jewish people. The Russians had these horrible pogroms where they would murder and rape them in the streets, and kill as many as they possibly could. Same thing was going on all over Europe. In Poland, in France, they had anti-Jewish riots. So this is going on all over. There were anti-Jewish people in the United States. There still are. Obviously, there still are anti-Semitic people in the United States. It's not as bad in the United States as it was in Europe at the time. So Christians, for some reason, the Christians hated the Jews. And I keep asking this question and nobody's got an answer for me. What the hell is wrong with the Jews? I ask this in almost every class. Does anybody have a clue why the Russians hated the Jews so bad? Why the Germans hated the Jews so much that they would kill them all? Not just the adult males, they killed the females too. Not just the females and the males, they killed the little children. The babies. Because they were Jewish. Obviously, it was a religious question. So what in the world is wrong with Jewish people? Why can't Jews and Christians get along? What's going on here? Is all this confusing? I had a friend from West Virginia, hated Jewish people. And he didn't have a rationale for it. He didn't know why he hated them. But he hated them. Hated them desperately. Would have killed them all. He told me that. He said the same thing about Obama. But hated Obama. My God. What's wrong with Obama? I don't like the way he talks. What do you mean you don't like the way he talks? You hate people because of the way they talk? Come on. I know. So what's wrong with Jewish people? Does anybody have any answer at all? Are they too tall? Or is their hair too curly? Is their skin too dark? Are their noses too long? Are they prettier than you are, so you hate them? What's wrong with their religion? It's the first part of the Bible. Is their Bible.
Could it be a mixed breed issue?
Mixed breed. No, they're the chosen people. They're fairly pure. They don't really interact with other groups, so they don't really mix with other groups. They haven't been allowed to.
The Christians probably want to be the chosen people, like.
They'll never be the chosen people. It's right there in the damn Bible.
Well, they
Unless
probably
they do.
want to, like, try to erase.
Small B Bible.
Try to erase the Jews from the world, exterminate them, so they can be the next level of people.
That's not the way it works. God's got to choose you, and He already chose them. I don't think He's going to choose another group.
But isn't Jesus Jewish?
He sure was.
So if you hate Jews, you might hate Jesus,
Okay.
Right? Or just they don't know that, maybe?
They don't know that. Come on, it's right there. All you have to do is read the damn thing.
Maybe they don't read it, they just kind of hold it up and that's it.
This is rough.
Does Jesus got something to do with it?
Jesus had something to do with it? Sure he did. Of course he did.
Could it be,
Did Jesus say he hated Jews? How could he say that? He was Jewish. His mother was Jewish. His brothers, his sisters were Jewish.
but then Jesus had enemies too.
Sure.
Could the enemies of the Jews still be considered the same enemies as the enemies that Jesus had?
So, well, he preached against some of the negative things that the Jewish people were doing. He said that they needed to change.
And that's it.
They didn't change.
The ones that didn't change split up to two different groups.
No,
Could it be because
he didn't really convert a whole lot of Jewish people in his lifetime. As a matter of fact, they didn't convert a whole lot of Jewish people after he died. They had to go out and find people who had other religions, and they converted those people. That's what the 12 disciples were.
Could it be because the Jews didn't believe in war?
They did. They fought. Don't you remember David slew I can't even remember what he was, but that big tall Goliath, he hit him with a rock in the forehead and killed him. Sure they fought. Jewish people fight. My goodness. They've always fought. That wasn't a problem.
Probably mad about that.
I'm sorry?
They're still probably mad about that, David killing the Goliath.
Goliath was, I don't know, he's a Himite
He's
or
probably
something. I don't
a
know.
Russian.
He was a Russian. Yeah. So nobody has an answer.
Well, the Jews always had enemies.
They did. Yeah, they were surrounded by enemies, and they're surrounded today by enemies. We are their friends. That's about it. Us and maybe the Brits and maybe the French. That's about it. They don't have a whole lot of allies. The Arabs hate them for some reason, one reason or another. Anyway, but Hitler tried to exterminate them all, and of course, that was a Christian country. Germany, why would he do that? Why do Christians hate Jews? And the answer has to have something to do with the fact that when they interpreted the Bible. And of course, the Bible was a bunch of different books, and they picked and chose which books they were going to choose. Their idea was that the Jewish population in Israel decided that Jesus should be executed. Now, of course, Jewish people weren't in charge. The Romans were in charge. So the Romans were the ones that actually executed Jesus. Okay. And it was a centurion that stuck him in the side and in the liver and killed him, actually. So, I mean, it was a Roman that killed him, but according to a lot of interpretations, and that's their interpretations, the Jewish people killed Jesus.
Could it be the Russians hate the Jews because the Jews resisted going underneath the Russian ways of life or standards?
Well, they always have their own standards. And part of the reason that people don't like them is because they don't change just because of where they are. So they don't adapt to everybody else's, the way other people act. They learn their language. They learned Russian. Yiddish is a mixture of Russian, Hebrew, and German. They learned their language. They learned the language. They learned English when they moved to England. They learned English when they moved to the United States. Sorry about this argument. It's really kind of a strange argument. Let me explain to you what was going on with Milgram's obedience study. Or did I explain to you last time? He took two people came in, there was an experimenter, and then he had two people coming in. They were talking about education, and they were trying to educate people by shocking them with electric shock. And they thought if they punished them, of course, they would learn better. So they put one guy in a room, and he was the learner, and the other guy was the teacher. And the teacher, if the guy got it wrong, he had to shock him. Well, it turned out that guy was dumb as dirt, because he kept getting everything wrong. And he was supposed to shock him. So he had to shock him with stronger and stronger and stronger voltage every time. Theoretically, that would have taught him how. Eventually, of course, he shocked him so much that he could have killed him. So the question was, would he do it? Would he shock the guy right up to the point? Well, we already talked about this last time. 65% of the people shocked him right up to the end because they were obedient. So when they switched to females, of course, the females did exactly the same thing, about 65%. So whether it's a male or whether it's a female, everybody's obedient to about 65%. Zimbardo's Stanford prison study was kind of interesting. It was done at Stanford. It was done with a bunch of Stanford college students. They had a mock-up prison in the basement of the psychology building. And they took them down there. They arrested. Randomly, they selected who was going to be the prison guards and who were going to be the prisoners. And they put them in the prison. And they put him in prison. This is a mock-up prison. And of course, these are all college kids. Yesterday they're college kids, today they're prisoners, or today they're prison guards. Well, what happened was they didn't realize this was going to happen. Zimbardo didn't have any clue that this was going to happen. But when they arrested the individuals and put them in the mock prison, they started acting like prisoners. And when they assigned the prison guards, those guys were mean to the prisoners, despite the fact that yesterday they were college students, today they're abusive prison guards. And they thought, well, this was going to change. Everything's going to change. Eventually, they're going to get used to their roles, and they will, because they're highly educated, some of the smartest kids in the country. Because of that, they will change, but they didn't. They stayed. They kept the same roles, and the prison guards got meaner and more abusive, and the prisoners got more and more depressed. And they had to stop it early. They had to stop the thing early because one kid threatened suicide. Another, they were planning a prison break, and the guards were coming up with more and more ridiculous ways of torturing their prisoners. So they had to stop the experiment. Now here's the other bizarre part. Zimbardo himself was the prison warden, and he was overseeing everything. And as the prison warden, he missed all of this stuff. The guy's got a PhD in psychology, and he's the one who put the damn experiment together. And when he got into his role as the warden, he lost sight of what was going on as well.
Wasn't it his wife the one that told him, like, what are you doing? Because she was watching it with him.
Exactly.
And he finally snapped out of it and said, you know what, I shouldn't have put myself in this role because now I'm like them.
Exactly. But it wasn't his wife. It was his girlfriend. Wasn't married. She was a student at the school. I know he was dating a student. I know, it's shocking. I was shocked when I found out. So after Milgram's experiment and after Zimbardo's experiment, they realized, wait a minute, we need to oversee all this stuff. We need to make sure nobody gets hurt. So that's when the institutional review boards were developed to meet the needs of the psychological community and research. Before the 1970s, the institutional review boards didn't exist. And you could do any experiment you wanted.
Is that what the IRB?
That's the IRB.
Stupid.
Exactly. I know, as exciting as that is. Milgram died right after the experiment. As strange as that doesn't have anything to do with anything. Zimbardo's still alive and writing textbooks, so that's kind of interesting. I won't use one of his textbooks.
Why?
Because he's blind. The guy has an experiment and he didn't see it. And he's also from California, so I try to use people from the middle of the country. People from the East Coast, they're blind to anything else in the United States. People from the West Coast, they're blind to everything else. But people in the middle, they see what's going on. They're not blind to the East Coast and West Coast.
So you're not blind?
I'm trying not to. I realize Zimbardo was a jerk. The world very much dictates to social psychologists what it is that they will study. In the 1940s, prejudice seemed to grip the world, and it was the main topic of interest to social psychologists. What the hell's going on over here? We've got all these fascist movements all over the world, and they're trying to. The Germans are saying that only blonde-headed and blue-eyed Germans, the Aryans, they're the chosen people. The Italians are down there saying exactly the same thing. Now, if you know anything about Italy, the northern Italy is more like the rest of Europe, and southern Italy is different. So southern Italians, they have darker skin, they have blacker hair, but if you go up to northern Italy, they've got blonde hair, blue eyes. They're just like the Swiss, they're just like the French, they're just like everybody else. As weird as that is. So we started getting all of these really strange things coming out of Italy, strange ideas coming out of Germany. Germans hate the Jews have caused all the problems in the world. If we could exterminate all the Jews, then we wouldn't have any more trouble in the world. There wouldn't be any more wars. The Jewish people are starting wars because they own armament factories. They own all these factories, and so they're starting these wars and keeping them going so that they can make more and more money. That was the rationale. Of course, the Nazis took over in Germany, and it certainly didn't stop them from creating a new war that encompassed the entire world. They started another world war, despite the fact that they had imprisoned all the Jewish people in the country. And of course, part of their rationale for putting those people in prison was the fact that Jewish people started all the wars. Wait a minute. Are you seeing how illogical this is? All Jewish people start all the wars, and they keep them going so that they can make more money from their factories. But then the Nazis took over all the factories. They imprisoned all the Jewish people, and then they started one of the most god-awful wars you can possibly imagine. So obviously they were incorrect. Did Jewish people actually start World War II? They claim that they started World War I so that they could sell arms and ammunition because they owned so many factories. Well, it's totally illogical. Anyway, this is what was going on in the 1940s. And of course, in order to win the war, we had to bring everybody together. But of course, it wasn't that pretty. When World War II started in 1941, and we started drafting people into the Army, we drafted everybody. We drafted everybody we possibly could. We didn't try to separate people. We didn't have black units. We didn't have white units. Yes, we did. Yeah, we did. We segregated the units because the soldiers from the South would not serve with African Americans. I know. So D-Day, 1944, all the units that landed on D-Day were all white because there were no black combat units, and they were segregated. Now, my dad was in his integrated unit, and the reason he was in an integrated unit was because he was in the Signal Corps, and they set up, they set up communications. So he was in an integrated unit. Well, they marched all the way through. They got off the beach and they marched all the way through France, and they got stuck in Belgium. There's a woods up there called the Ardennes. It's a very thick forest. And just south of the Ardennes is the Hurtgen Forest. And the Germans stopped us right there at the Hurtgen Forest. And we kept trying to break through. We couldn't break through. And of course, we just had the units that we had landing at Normandy. We were bringing other units in, but there weren't enough of them. And we were losing men left and right. So at the Hurtgen Forest in late 1944, we were running out of guys. We were running out of men. So they went to all of these units and they said, we need volunteers for the front lines. And at that point, they allowed African Americans to fight in combat. So they fought from the Hurtgen Forest, and then of course the Bulge happened. But all the way through the rest of Germany, the rest of the war, all the way through May, African Americans were allowed to fight in the war because they volunteered. Before they were service personnel. They were driving trucks and setting up wires and whatnot. But after the Hurtgen Forest, of course, all bets were off. Despite whatever the Southern soldiers wanted, they needed the men. They needed them desperately.
But women couldn't fight, right, in the 1940s?
I'm sorry?
Women?
No, of course not. Hell no. What are you talking about? They weren't allowed to fight until the 2010 or something like that. Yeah, sorry about that. Somebody stole your chair. Okay.
I'll steal it back after class.
That's good. 1950s, so after World War II was over with, then we realized, oh my God, look at the United States. Despite the fact that we started all this propaganda about, hey, everybody's the same, we need to bring everybody together, and we need to live as brothers. We started this propaganda in the 1940s so that we could fight the war. After the war, we'd already convinced everybody that they needed to be brothers, so after the war we realized, oh my God, look what's going on in the South. Some African Americans can't even get educated. They won't let them in school. Their schools only run to the 8th grade. This isn't right. So we realized there was a problem with intolerance in the United States. The other thing that happened was a lot of these black soldiers came back and they felt equal to everybody else. In a foxhole, who's superior? Well, neither of you are superior because you're both protecting each other. You are brothers. Literally, you're brothers in arms. And you have to protect each other. No matter who that guy is, he's got your back. And if he doesn't have your back, you're dead, he's dead, everybody's dead. So in combat, there are no religions and there are no races, as it turns out. And they realized this after World War II. So they came back, and African Americans, and of course, some of the states in the South have 30% African Americans. These guys didn't want to go back to where they were before, Jim Crow. And so the issue that came up in the 1950s was intolerance. And there were a lot of lynchings in the South. There were uppity African Americans who they thought that if they killed them, then it would be all over with. They wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. They could go back to where they were in the 1930s, where African Americans knew their place. But of course, it doesn't work that way. You can never go back. You can't go back. You have to keep moving forward. So intolerance was the issue in the 1950s. In the 1960s, of course, they were fighting over civil rights. Civil rights started in the early 1950s. Went into the 1960s. They were fighting for civil rights. This is when Martin Luther King Jr. became prevalent in the black community, fighting against intolerance. And then in the 1960s, the Vietnam War started. And the Vietnam War didn't make a whole lot of sense to a whole lot of people, especially the young kids that had to go and fight. So we started rioting in the streets again. I mean, we had riots in the streets. So aggression was the question. Why are people so angry? What's going on in the world? Then in the 1970s, after the civil rights movement and the peace movement against the war in Vietnam, women in the United States realized, you know, we fought half this war against intolerance in the United States. So we should be recognized. We need equal rights in the United States. You mean women weren't equal to men? And the answer is no. A lot of women weren't allowed to work outside the home by their husbands. There was this idea that men are in charge. So feminism became the watchword of the 1970s. Then in the 1980s, remember the Cold War is going on. After the end of World War II, the communists, the Russians, became very strong, very powerful. And we needed to confront them to keep them from taking over the entire world. And they confronted us to keep us from taking over the entire world. So we started massing these nuclear weapons. And so the arms race in the 1980s was the huge argument. And of course, you guys were all part of this, because where did they get their uranium? From right here. Yeah, from right over on the other side of the mountain. Here and up in Canada, strangely enough. That's made us very, very friendly with the Canadians at the same time. So the arms race was going on in the 1980s, and the argument was mutual assured destruction. This doesn't make any sense. You can kill us 256 times, we can kill you 257 times. Does that make us ahead? Well, no, because if we start exploding bombs, then everybody's dead anyway.
Mine is bigger than yours.
Then in the 1990s, the question was, well, so all through this time we're getting new people on television. All of a sudden we're seeing people that don't look like everybody else. Remember in the 1930s, we never saw anybody with black hair in the movies. Everybody had blonde hair and brown hair. Very rarely did you see anybody with black hair. And if you did see somebody with black hair, they were the bad guy. They didn't have a black hat on, they had black hair. And if it was a good person, then they dyed their hair a different color. And then in the 1940s, of course, they tried to bring everybody together. The 1950s, everything went back to the way it was before. So we had this encroachment of people coming in. We hated Italians. I mean, they hated Italians in the 1920s and 1930s. And then all of a sudden, in the 1950s, Italians were acceptable. So slowly, all of these groups began breaking down the barriers that kept them out of society, that ghettoized them, that isolated them. Religion could isolate you. For the longest time, Catholics were considered it was a negative religion because Protestants controlled the United States. And it's very slowly the Catholics became acceptable to American society, American general society. And then, of course, so all of these walls are breaking down. In the 1990s, the walls came tumbling down. And so now everybody's all mixed together. Now we're seeing more black faces on television. We're seeing people who are Hispanic on television. We're seeing people that are potentially gay on television. Didn't see any of this before. And if somebody was gay, nobody said anything about it. So we didn't know. But then in the 1990s, all this changed. Of course, with the internet, everything changed anyway. Now all of a sudden, we don't have one media. Now we have the internet, so you can look anything up that you want. So people were living in different worlds. Before, television was it. I mean, that was the only entertainment we had. And everybody watched the same shows. So we all watched. So if you wanted to control things, you wanted to control who was acceptable and who was unacceptable, you put only one group of people on your television show. But of course, this is liberal Southern California. They started putting different people on television. Blossom was on television, the girl with the big nose, Megan Bilek, who's on Big Bang Theory now. She's Amy Farrah. I know, weird stuff's going on in the United States, so diversity was the watchword. We saw, actually in the 1990s, we saw white people married to black people on television shows, not on commercials. If you put it on a commercial, then nobody would buy your stuff. I know, this is crazy, but we started seeing this. So we started seeing interracial relationships. So diversity became the watchword in the 1990s, as much fun as that is. Okay. 1950s, remember, it was intolerance. A lot of intolerance in the world, especially in the South. I can remember I was alive when they integrated Little Rock Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. They had to send they sent the National Guard in, and the National Guard wouldn't do anything about it. So Eisenhower, who was president at the time, he sent in the paratroopers. he sent in the national government, and he shouldn't have been able to do that, but he did it. And they replaced the National Guard, and they allowed the black students to go to school. Now in the North, black students have been going to white schools forever, since the end of slavery. They've been going to white schools for a long, long time. So this didn't make any sense to anybody in the North. Why in the world would you not want these kids in your school? It just doesn't make any sense. But in the South, they had never seen it before. Black people and white people were never educated together. So if you lived in Kentucky and Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, then everything was segregated. If you've ever seen the movie, Remember the Titans, that was a movie from the 1970s. That was a school in Virginia, and it was right next to Maryland. Well, of course, Maryland was segregated too. But it was a school right next to Washington, D.C. And here, this was the 1970s, and the school had never had black students in it before. So all of a sudden, it had black students in it. I know, it was a shock. And so it was how the school was able to survive and create a football team out of black students and white students. And you saw the conflict going on. So there's a lot of intolerance going on in the United States. And a lot of people want it to go back to the way it was. That's what the March in Charlottesville was all about. What was it, 2 years ago? Yeah, that's what that was all about. I don't know if you remember the Tiki Torch March. As dumb as that sounds. Jews will never replace us. Remember what they were saying? Really? There's that many Jews that they could replace us, guys? What are they talking about? Was everybody confused as to what they were yelling about?
What confused me is that they're Christians.
Sure.
So I don't know how they get over the fact that Jesus was a Jew.
Oh, no, he was the first Christian. There you go. I see, I answered your question for you. He wasn't Jewish, he was the first Christian. Yeah, Christians have been intolerant it's an intolerant religion. Any religion that won't accept other religions is intolerant. As confusing as that is. I know, religions are supposed to be all-inclusive, but they're not.
I think that's most religions are like that.
Yeah, that's the problem. That's the problem. 1960s, it was aggression. That was the argument. And if we look at this picture, this is actually a peace rally that was broken up by the kids who were not peaceniks that were not hippies. And you can tell the difference between the good guys and the bad guys, or I don't know, whichever side you want to fight on. But the guys with the long hair that look like, kind of like hippies, those are the ones that are were marching for peace. And the individuals that don't have long hair and are all dressed like they were preppies, those are the guys that were fighting against it. A lot of aggression during the time, a lot of riots in the United States. Riots all over the world. 1968 was a year when they had riots in Paris. They tore up the streets and they built barricades. They had riots in Poland, and this was a communist country. They had riots in Berlin, they had riots in Bonn, they had riots in London, they had riots all over the world. The places that theoretically were peaceful, and of course who they blamed it on was the communists. As confusing as that is, I need to know what time it is. Okay, I'm okay. 1970s, it was feminism. One of the things that happened, so 1950s had to do with the civil rights movement. And the 1960s had to do with the anti-war movement in the United States. Well, women were part of all of this thing. It's not just men that, well, you saw all the women that were marching for civil rights. There was a problem. There was a problem. And one of the reasons that they had women marching was because if it was all black men, what would happen next?
Violence.
A lot of violence, yeah, sure. Exactly. Well, we saw what happened in this picture. There's no ladies in that picture, and what we have is a mass fist fight. But when we were talking about civil rights, if you've got a bunch of black males that are marching for civil rights, and there aren't any females in the group, the police don't have any problems attacking those guys. So we saw this a lot. We saw a lot of black females marching. And they became the major part of the movement. A lot of times they would march on the outside and the men would march on the inside. Because if the men were on the outside, people would pick them off. Somebody would grab them and try to beat them up. But if the women were marching on the outside, then usually they didn't have that problem. It could be a peaceful march if the women were in front and if they were around the sides. Isn't that horrible? So what's wrong with black males? Why are white males so afraid of black males? If you watch, what is that? Cops, the television show Cops. It's always black males. And the white cops don't shoot black females. But they shoot black males all the time. They just shot a kid, he had a gun that looked like a real pistol. It was shaped like a real pistol. Of course, it had the red thing on it, showing that it was not a real gun. He had just stolen it, actually. And he's running away from the policeman. The policeman just shot him right in the back. Because he had a gun, 14-year-old kid. He broke into this truck, stole the gun, was running away from the policeman, and the policeman shot him. Black male. That if he had been a female, would the cop have shot him? So what's wrong with black males? Why are they so dangerous? Are they more dangerous than anybody else? Why isn't anybody else getting shot? Why are only black males getting shot? What's going on?
Fear.
What's so fearful about the black males? They have lots of...
They're strong, physically.
I can do more push-ups than they can.
Just their stereotype.
Stereotype?
Yeah.
The way that the media displays them or
Yeah.
people.
This goes way back before the media had anything to do with it.
Back to the slave.
But you are right. The media, especially cops, shows black males and they're scary. You know, all they have to do is not smile, and all of a sudden, you think they're Mr. T or something. Which was the thing about Mr. T. Did you ever see Mr. T smile?
No.
He was in a boxing movie with what was it?
Rocky.
The Italian stallion. Rocky Balboa, yeah, he was fighting Rocky Balboa. Oh, he was mean. And he'd start hitting you, and he'd hold you with one hand, and he'd just hit you with the other. And he had that crease in his forehead. Oh, he looked mean. him and the Norwegian guy that was supposed to be a Russian? Yeah, okay. I guess they just made another Rocky movie.
With the same Norwegian guy.
Yeah, with the same Norwegian guy, looking, who's actually a Russian, or he's actually Norwegian. Anyway, okay, so there's something wrong with black males, obviously, everybody attacks them, and we're still shooting them in the streets for no reason whatsoever. So what was going on, we had the peace movement, and the women were in the peace movement, they had the civil rights movement, and they were a major part of the civil rights movement, and then they realized we're still second-class citizens. And even the guys that we're marching with, they treat us that way. I mean, we all did the same stuff today, and when we went home, guess who had to cook? Yeah, that's not fair. We all worked. Who says that women have to do all the work?
Man.
Men do, of course. Well, it's in the Bible, but maybe, well, anyway. So they were marching for equality, and they tried to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed, and they missed it by one state. One state. I know, they missed it by one state. Anyway, my sister was a feminist.
I like her sign.
Equality, the times
No,
is
the other
not.
one.
Don't be a clown, take women seriously. Okay. Well, anyway, so that's, and there were other things that were going on. They were looking for equality. They thought that the clothes that they wore were designed by men to make women different, so they burned their brassieres. I didn't say bras, I know. They burned their brassieres to show men that they weren't in charge, damn it, they couldn't tell them what to wear. And of course, and it's changed the way that people see the world. And that was in the 1970s. 1980s, of course, it looked like we were all going to kill each other. And we saw all these really strange movies about nuclear winners, and there were comedy shows where the Russians, I don't know. Anyway, there was mutual assured destruction. Of course, I was in the military at this time. I was in from 71 through 83. So yeah, this was real. And we talked about nuclear weapons, and we talked about how many bombs we had and how many bombs they had, and first strike capabilities, and what would happen next. And we were hiding our silos so that they couldn't find them. Anyway, hey, Sharon, how you doing? Good. Anyway, that's the 1980s. Fun times at Ridgemont High, of course. 1990s, of course, it was diversity. And of course, I'm showing you the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. And if we look at them, there is one of each group. Isn't that exciting? Here's an Asian girl. This, who knows? I don't know. I have no idea. Here's a black person. And then we have all those in between. We have minorities there, and probably there's a white person there, but I don't know which one's white.
The black guy gets a black.
I was gonna
Yeah, the
say
black guy
that.
gets a black. The yellow, the Asian gets the yellow side. So is this guy American Indian because he's got a red suit on?
Did you see that? You should
Never
watch
noticed
the
that.
video. It makes fun of this, and you gotta watch it. I'll probably email it to you. Maybe
Okay,
you can
thank you, that will be fun. Well, who's this guy? Obviously he's in charge, I'm guessing.
Yeah,
Okay, well.
probably Trump.
In the 1990s. Okay. In the 2000s, it was terrorism. I was in several terrorist attacks when I was in Germany. Of course, the terrorists weren't the same ones that they are today. They were communists. So we were being attacked by communists. And actually, I was at Ramstein when they blew up US Safety headquarters. And I was the first medic on the scene. It's funny. I've got pictures of it. It's kind of funny. Well, it's not that funny. Nobody was hurt. Don't worry. Nobody was killed. 3 people were in the building at the time. The Germans, being Germans, of course, these were German terrorists. They figured, well, they're having an exercise today, so headquarters should be full. So they blew the thing up at like 7 o'clock in the morning. Yeah. I was just coming on to base. They blew it up at 7 o'clock in the morning. How am I doing that time? They blew it up at 7 o'clock in the morning, thinking that everybody would be, or it was, well, it's closer to 8 o'clock in the morning, They figured everybody would be there. They're having an exercise today, so everybody should be at headquarters, right? Nobody was at headquarters. They all taken the day off because everybody else on base they were exercising. These were the officers. These were the people that were in charge. So they took the damn day off. Everybody in the building took the day off, and there were only 3 people there. Of course, if it had been a German base and they had been Germans, of course all the officers would have been. They would all be there trying to make sure that the exercise went right. But no. Everybody else was on base, but there was nobody at headquarters building. So they kind of made a mistake. You know how Germans are. They're kind of OCD, just a little bit OCD. So they assumed we're like they are. We're not. We're not at all. So they blew up USAV headquarters. Anyway, most of the people that were hurt were in the dental clinic right across the street from the USAV headquarters. The building didn't actually collapse. It moved it off its foundation, but it didn't blow up the building. And the reason it didn't blow it up is because when they built the building, they didn't build it out of cement. They built it out of plaster. These are Germans, and they were trying to save as much money as possible. It's really kind of, and that's the reason it moved off its foundation. If it had been cement, it would have shaken itself to death, but it didn't happen. Anyway, in the 2000s, of course, the Islamic extremists started a terrorist attacks all around the world, which is kind of interesting. Now, strangely enough, if you understand where these guys came from, they were all trained by us. Some of them were trained by us. Osama bin Laden was trained by us. And the reason we trained him was because the Russians invaded Afghanistan in 1980, and of course they called a jihad, and all of these Muslim extremists went to Afghanistan to fight against the Russians, and we thought that was a really good idea, so we trained them how to do all these interesting things. So it was our CIA that trained a lot of these terrorists, as interesting as that is, in the 1980s, to fight against the Russians. And then, of course, thinking that we could control them, but the reality is, of course, they were mad. They were mad at everybody, not just the Russians, but they were also mad at us, because we are the great Satans or something, I don't know. Anyway, so terrorism became huge in the 2000s. As humans, of course, when we look at something, a lot of times we have an idea of what it is, and we try to make sense out of everything that we see. And a good example of this is an optical illusion. This, of course, is an optical illusion showing people in white robes, and then, of course, they eventually turn into a stream. We don't have people up the cliff. We have a stream. Another optical illusion. The closer to the guitar player, the more we see it as houses, but as it moves out, they turn into people. Optical illusion. How many horses are there?
Hey, Bev Doolittle. What's the name of the artist?
You know him?
Her.
Her. Sorry. How many horses are there? I know, it's hard to count them. Don't count their legs, count their noses. Right? There's 5, yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So you know who did this? Oh, that's cool.
It's called camouflage art.
Oh.
She has a bunch of other pieces where there's a bunch of like figures hidden. If you look into it,
That's
there's other artists that do it too, but she was one of the more famous ones.
This is cool. And of course, that's another optical illusion. Is the little girl part of the jigsaw puzzle, or is she somebody that's putting the jigsaw puzzle together? That is the question. Optical illusions. Though most scientists would like to deny it, it is nearly impossible for them to put their cultural values aside and view another culture or their own with an open mind. Very, very difficult. And this has been a problem not only in psychology, but also in science, in all the sciences. We can't put our culture, we can't arrest our culture, we can't put it in our pockets and not think about it. Everything has a cultural aspect to it. That's what was happening when they were trying to debate the confrontation between the American Indian elder and the high school kid from Covington, Kentucky. They couldn't do it. They couldn't put themselves in somebody else's shoes. They had to debate it from their own point of view, from their own value judgments. And of course, as scientists, we need to do that. We need to look at things from a general perspective rather than from our own cultural perspective. That was the problem when Europeans first came here. They tried to interpret everything from their Christian, English, or Spanish point of view. And they couldn't do it. They couldn't see you for who you were. They tried to interpret you through their own values. And of course, since you weren't Christian, that changed everything as far as they were concerned. So what did they do? They tried to convert everybody. And this went on into the 20th century. They were still trying to convert you guys. When the Indian War stopped in the 1890s, they were sending missionaries to convert you guys. Is it time? Yeah, it's time to convert you guys. And this is known as value judgment. So you need, this is one of the things that is very difficult for people to do, is to get rid of their value judgments. This is commonly known as social representations. You have your social representations, and of course I have mine. And I'll tell you what mine are next time.